Okay, the reading for this week is the next part in our series on Chinese civilization, Chinese philosophy, Chinese culture, classical culture. And today we will be reading an excerpt from the Zhuangzi Japanese Soshi. Zhuangzi, one of the seminal figures of Taoism, foundational figures of Taoism, who had an enormous influence on Japanese literature, Japanese culture, especially in the Edo period with poets, haikai poets such as Matsuo Basho and Yosa Buson and so forth. So we will be reading an excerpt from chapter 3 of the Zhuangzi. The Secret of Caring for Life is the title of that chapter. And once again, make sure I don't turn it off. I accidentally cut the video off in the last video. Once again, the excerpt is taken from sources of Chinese tradition, compiled by William Theodore de Barry and Irene Bloom. And let me begin with an introduction. Zhuangzi was a historically verifiable man. Okay, some scholars say that he didn't exist, or he may not have existed, but I think the consensus is that he did exist as a single historical individual who lived somewhere around 360 to 280 BC. The long book that bears his name, the Zhuangzi, it's a very fat book. There's several translations, I think, but the one I have here in my office is by Burton Watson, who did the standard translation. The long book that bears his name is a combination of material that represents his own thinking and of other writings incorporated by various compilers and editors. So the inner chapters, I think the first 4 or 5 inner chapters are said to be definitely by him, and the other ones, there's some debate about who actually inserted those later chapters in the Zhuangzi. Like Confucius, Mencius, Han Fei, of Han Feize and others, Zhuangzi lived during the time when the kings of the Zhou dynasty had little real power, and the kingdom had disintegrated into feudal states that were constantly at war with each other in shifting patterns of alliances and enmities. During the Warring States period, so this is the last part of the Zhou dynasty, 480 to 221 BC. So during this Warring States period, Zhuangzi and Laozi were not considered to be part of a single school of thought. Okay, so remember, keep in mind that Taoism, when people refer to Daojiao or Taoism, this is a category that was established much, much later and applied to both Zhuangzi and Laozi. But in their day, they were not really associated with one another. Zhuangzi is more concerned with escaping from the world. Laozi with cunning ways of ruling it. I don't know if that's true. Laozi is kind of the more hippie-ish of the two, I think, but we'll talk about that after reading this passage. During the Han Dynasty, both works concern with the Tao. Both the Laozi and the Zhuangzi are concerned with the Tao, or the way of heaven, and their mystical understanding of that term inspired historians to lump them together under the single category of Taoism, Daojiao in Japanese, Dokyo in Japanese, Daojiao in Chinese. The name stuck. Zhuangzi and Laozi are now forever linked as the two great progenitors of Taoist philosophy and religion. That's the introduction. The source material, I'll provide a link in the description to the sources of Chinese tradition, so you can purchase it and follow along as you listen to this and read. Selection from the Zhuangzi, Chapter 3, The Secret of Caring for Life. And this is the famous episode about Cook Ding. Okay, so we can discuss the meaning of this episode in class, but it's a very, very famous and very important and philosophically profound message that he's trying to get across here. Your life has a limit, but knowledge has none. Let me take a break here and read the study guide questions before I read the passage from chapter 3. Question number 1. How does Zhuangzi suggest that one live one's life? How might his recommendation have been influenced by the chaotic and warlike times in which he lived? Question 2. How is the concept of the way, or the Tao, relevant to understanding the story of Cook Ding? Question 3. How does Zhuangzi's approach to life contrast to that of Confucius and Mencius? to that of Han Fei, who wrote the Han Feizi, the legalist, the Fa Jia school, to that of Han Fei and Lord Shang of the legalist school. So how is Zhuangzi's philosophy different from these other philosophers? Okay, now back to chapter 3, the story of cook Ding the cook. Your life has a limit, but knowledge has none. If you use what is limited to pursue what has no limit, you will be in danger. If you understand this and still strive for knowledge, you will be in danger for certain. If you do good, stay away from fame. If you do evil, stay away from punishments. Follow the middle, follow the Zhong, right? The mean. The doctrine of the mean is the Zhong. Follow the Zhong, the middle. Go by what is constant, and you can stay in one piece. Keep yourself alive. Look after your parents and live out your years. Cook Ding, underline Cook Ding, very famous character who appears here in this chapter 3. Cook Ding was cutting up an ox for Lord Wenhui. At every touch of his hand, every heave of his shoulder, every move of his feet, every thrust of his knee, zip, zoop, he slithered the knife along with a zing, and all was in perfect rhythm, as though he were performing the dance of the mulberry grove, or keeping time to Jing Shou music. And there's a note here, the mulberry grove is identified as a rain dance from the time of King Tang of the Shang Dynasty. King Tang is the sort of tyrannical Tang of the late Shang Dynasty, and the Jing Shou music is part of a longer composition from the time of Yao. Right. Ah, this is marvelous, said Lord Wenhui. Imagine skill reaching such heights. So he's very impressed by Cook Ding. Cook Ding laid down his knife and replied, "What I care about is the Tao, the way, which goes beyond skill." So what I'm doing has to do more with the Tao than with skill. When I first began cutting up oxen, all I could see was the ox itself. After 3 years, I no longer saw the whole ox. And now I go at it by spirit, and don't look with my eyes. Perception and understanding have come to a stop, and spirit moves where it wants. Okay, so people who comment about this episode of anecdote of Cook Ding often compare it to being in the zone in basketball and sports and so forth. When you're in the zone, you're not thinking consciously about what you're doing. When Michael Jordan's on a roll and has hit 5 3-pointers in a row, he's not thinking consciously about what he's doing. He's just in a zone, and he's in a sort of a separate realm of consciousness, and a higher level of consciousness that is not really consciously aware of what is going on, but is more just intuitively aligned with everything that is around him in his environment and so forth. I go along with the natural makeup, strike in the big hollows, guide the knife through the big openings, and follow things as they are. So he follows the lines of the ox rather than trying to cut it up into some prescribed form that he has in his predetermined form. So I never touch the smallest ligament or tendon, much less a main joint. He goes in between the meat and the ligaments and the tendons, so forth. A good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts. A mediocre cook changes his knife once a month because he hacks. I've had this knife of mine for 19 years, and I have cut up thousands of oxen with it, and yet the blade is as good as though it had just come from the grindstone. There are spaces between the joints, and the blade of the knife has really no thickness. If you insert what has no thickness into such spaces, then there's plenty of room, more than enough for the blade to play about it. That's why after 19 years the blade of my knife is still as good as when it first came from the grindstone. However, whenever I come to a complicated place, I size up the difficulties, tell myself to watch out and be careful, keep my eyes on what I'm doing, work very slowly, and move the knife with the greatest subtlety until flop. The whole thing comes apart like a clod of earth crumbling to the ground. I stand there holding the knife and look all around me, completely satisfied and reluctant to move on. And then I wipe off the knife and put it away. So his knife sustains no damage. It's always in perfect shape because it encounters minimal resistance when he's cutting. Excellent, said Lord Wang Hui. I have heard the works of Cook Ding and learned how to care for life. Okay, so the implication, of course, is that the message, the description given by Cook Ding here can be applied not just to butchery, but to life as a whole, and that one should live one's life as Cook Ding goes about cutting up oxen. All right, so we can talk about the lessons of this episode in more detail in class, and that is all for now. This is a very short passage from chapter 3 of the Zhuangzi. I will see you in class. Goodbye.